They were told the hospital was safe, that the doctors were there to help, and that cooperation would only make things easier. Yet as they lay on clean beds under white lights, a question slowly took shape in their minds, one that had nothing to do with pain or recovery, and everything to do with what happens when a prisoner hands over his body willingly and later realizes he may not be the one who decides what happens next. The hospital did not feel like part of the camp, and that separation was the first thing the prisoners noticed, even before the clean sheets or the quiet voices. It sat slightly apart, not hidden, yet not surrounded by the same tension that filled the barracks in a yard, as if it belonged to a different logic, one that operated alongside captivity without fully announcing itself as such. Men were sent there for practical reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with symbols or resistance. A wound that would not close, a fever that lingered too long, a body worn down by labor that did not stop simply because strength had begun to fail. None of these conditions felt heroic, yet all of them made the offer of treatment difficult to refuse, because pain narrows the world until relief becomes the only reasonable priority. Inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. The sharp edges of command were replaced by calm instructions delivered without urgency. Questions were asked instead of shouted. Movements were guided gently, not forced. The guards remained present, but they did not dominate the space, allowing the room to feel temporarily removed from the routines of discipline that governed the rest of the camp. This absence of hostility mattered more than comfort itself. In a place where every interaction usually carried an undertone of control, the clinic felt neutral, almost professional, and neutrality can be disarming when a man has learned to expect cruelty. For the first time since capture, attention was directed toward the body as a problem to be solved rather than a tool to be used. Trust did not arrive as a conscious decision. It developed quietly, through repetition and tone. A bandage adjusted without comment. A cup of water offered without instruction. A pause long enough to listen before writing something down. These gestures did not promise safety, but they suggested competence, and competence can feel reassuring even when intentions remain unclear. The prisoners did not interpret this experience as submission. They framed it as necessity. Accepting treatment did not feel like obedience, because obedience implies choice under pressure, while this felt like cooperation under reason. Pain made the decision feel simple. Refusal would not have proven strength. It would have prolonged discomfort without changing the broader reality of captivity. Still, the moment a man crossed into the clinic, something subtle shifted. Clothing was exchanged. Personal items were set aside. Movement slowed to match instruction. Time became structured around appointments rather than labor. None of this felt alarming on its own, yet together it created a condition where autonomy softened without resistance. Here, compliance did not carry the weight it did elsewhere. Following directions felt logical, even responsible, because those directions were framed as steps toward recovery. When the body improves, the mind often relaxes its defenses, allowing systems to operate without challenge as long as they appear to function smoothly. The clinic relied on procedure rather than authority. Records were kept. Measurements were taken. Notes accumulated quietly in folders that followed men from one visit to the next. Everything suggested order, and order has a powerful effect on people who have lived too long in chaos, because it offers the illusion of control returning, even when control has merely changed hands. What the prisoners did not recognize immediately was how different this form of control felt. It did not demand submission. It invited participation. It did not threaten consequence. It implied benefit. In that environment, resistance seemed unnecessary, even irrational, because nothing visible was being taken. Pain lessened. Wounds closed. Strength returned slowly. Each improvement reinforced the belief that cooperation had been the correct choice. The system appeared to work, and systems that work rarely provoke suspicion, especially when they offer relief. By the time the men left the clinic and returned to the barracks, they carried more than bandages and instructions. They carried a quiet recalibration of expectation. Somewhere inside, the idea formed that not every authority inside the camp operated through force, and that distinction mattered because it suggested that trust might sometimes be rewarded. At this stage, nothing felt wrong. Nothing had crossed a line. The clinic had done exactly what it claimed to do. Yet beneath that surface, a boundary had been crossed without notice, not by command, but by consent, as the prisoners learned that handing over the body could feel easier than protecting it. The realization had not yet arrived. For now, there was only relief, and relief has a way of delaying questions until after habits begin to form. The clinic did not change its appearance, yet the way the prisoners experienced it began to shift as visits became routine rather than exception. What had first felt like a pause from captivity slowly revealed itself as another structure within it, one that operated quietly and with remarkable consistency. Appointments followed a predictable rhythm. Names were called at the same hours. The same benches were used. The same questions returned with minor variations, as though the system was refining its understanding rather than simply treating symptoms. This repetition did not feel threatening, but it carried a weight of expectation that settled into the background of each visit. The men began to notice that treatment came with an unspoken requirement: availability. Being cared for meant being reachable. Instructions extended beyond bandages and rest, shaping daily movement in ways that felt subtle enough to accept without resistance. Return visits were scheduled without discussion, and compliance felt assumed rather than requested. Trust, once established, became a currency that the clinic quietly spent. The prisoners answered questions more freely, not because they were ordered to, but because the setting encouraged explanation. Describing pain required context. Context required memory. Memory required disclosure. Each step felt reasonable, even necessary, and the process unfolded without any moment that could be clearly identified as a loss of control. Records grew thicker. Files followed men from one appointment to the next, carrying details that extended beyond injuries. Background questions appeared woven into medical routine, asked casually enough to avoid suspicion. The tone remained calm, professional, and measured, which made refusal feel unnecessary and even counterproductive. Some prisoners began to sense that visits were less about immediate treatment and more about observation over time. The same doctor might ask similar questions weeks apart, noting changes not only in health, but in behavior. Responses were acknowledged with neutral expressions, neither approving nor condemning, leaving the impression that something was being assessed without explanation. The environment reinforced this dynamic. Bright light eliminated shadows. Silence reduced distraction. Privacy isolated each man from the collective awareness that had protected him elsewhere in the camp. In the yard, a prisoner was part of a group. In the clinic, he was a single body under examination, expected to speak clearly, wait patiently, and follow instruction without interruption. This isolation mattered. It created a space where authority did not feel imposed, but assumed. The men found themselves adjusting posture, moderating tone, and choosing words carefully, not out of fear, but out of an instinctive desire to remain cooperative within a system that had already demonstrated its effectiveness. Leaving the clinic did not immediately restore distance. Instructions carried forward into daily life. Certain movements were restricted. Certain tasks were delayed. Rest was prescribed. Observation continued indirectly as guards referenced notes and schedules aligned with medical guidance. Care extended beyond the building, shaping behavior without ever presenting itself as discipline. Conversations in the barracks began to change. Men compared experiences quietly, not in protest, but in confusion. One would mention a question that felt unrelated to treatment. Another would note a return visit that seemed unnecessary. A third would recall a detail from a previous appointment being repeated accurately weeks later. None of these moments proved wrongdoing. Yet together, they created a sense that the clinic operated with a purpose that extended beyond healing. Still, no one refused to return. The logic of cooperation remained intact. Treatment had reduced pain. The doctors had not lied. The system had not punished compliance. In the absence of visible harm, doubt struggled to justify itself. What unsettled the prisoners most was not what the clinic did, but what it normalized. Being examined, being recorded, being scheduled. These processes no longer felt invasive. They felt expected. The body had become part of a managed sequence, and management, once accepted, rarely invites reconsideration. By the end of this phase, the clinic no longer represented relief alone. It represented structure, continuity, and an authority that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. Trust had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, no longer resting on the promise of care, but on the assumption that participation was the correct and sensible path. The mistake, though not yet visible, had already begun to form, not through deception or force, but through a gradual agreement to let the system decide what was necessary, long before the prisoners realized that necessity itself could be defined by someone else. What changed was not announced, and that was what made it effective. The clinic continued to operate as it always had, with the same calm voices, the same orderly procedures, and the same absence of visible force. Yet the prisoners began to notice that the experience no longer felt temporary. Treatment was no longer something you passed through. It became something you remained inside of, even after you left the room. The first sign was how the body was discussed. Injuries were no longer described in the language of pain or recovery, but in terms of management. Timelines replaced sensations. Progress was measured externally rather than felt internally. A man might say he felt better, yet still be told to return, to wait, to follow instructions that no longer seemed connected to what he experienced inside his own skin. This disconnect did not create alarm immediately. It created confusion, and confusion is quieter. When expertise speaks with confidence, it can override perception, especially when that expertise has already delivered relief. The prisoners found themselves deferring to charts and notes rather than instincts, trusting records more than memory, and allowing schedules to define what their bodies were capable of. The process encouraged passivity without ever demanding it. Instructions were framed as standard procedure, not as orders, and standard procedure carries a legitimacy that discourages resistance. A man who questioned it did not feel brave. He felt unreasonable. The clinic did not threaten consequences, yet the implication was clear enough. Cooperation made everything smoother. Over time, this logic spread beyond the clinic itself. Daily routines adjusted around medical guidance. Certain tasks were deemed unsuitable. Certain movements were discouraged. Rest periods were extended or shortened based on decisions made elsewhere. The body, once a personal burden to endure, became a shared responsibility managed by a system that claimed efficiency and care. The prisoners noticed that others now spoke about their bodies in detached terms. Someone would refer to his leg as being monitored. Another would say his condition was on file. Language shifted subtly, removing ownership without anyone noticing the moment it happened. When the words change, the relationship changes with them. Isolation reinforced this transformation. Each appointment separated a man from the group, placing him alone under examination, expected to explain himself clearly and comply patiently. In that space, resistance felt awkward, even childish. The environment was designed to encourage calm, and calm discourages challenge. The longer this continued, the more the prisoners adjusted their expectations. They no longer anticipated making decisions about their own recovery. They waited to be told. Waiting felt responsible. Acting independently felt risky, not because punishment was certain, but because deviation might disrupt a system that appeared to function correctly. Some men began to notice moments where their own judgment conflicted with instruction. A pain that felt gone was treated as persistent. A weakness that felt manageable was classified as limiting. These moments created a quiet tension, because choosing which voice to trust required effort, and effort had already been trained out of the process. The clinic did not insist on obedience. It relied on routine to produce it. Each visit reinforced the idea that the body was something to be supervised, something that performed best when guided by expertise rather than instinct. This belief did not feel imposed. It felt logical. What unsettled the prisoners most was not any single act, but the cumulative effect. They began to feel slightly disconnected from their own physical state, as if sensation had become secondary to assessment. The body no longer felt fully theirs. It felt leased, temporarily assigned to a system that claimed to know it better than they did. By this stage, trust had completed its transformation. It no longer existed as confidence in care, but as acceptance of oversight. The prisoners had not been forced into submission. They had been guided into dependence, step by step, without any moment that demanded refusal. The realization, still incomplete, lingered at the edges of awareness. Something had shifted. The clinic was no longer simply a place where bodies were healed. It had become a place where authority over the body was quietly transferred, not through coercion, but through agreement. And once that transfer occurred, reclaiming control would no longer be a matter of walking away, because the question was no longer where the body was, but who was expected to decide what it needed. By the time the prisoners reached this stage, the clinic no longer felt like a separate space within the camp, because its influence had extended quietly into everyday life. Recovery was no longer measured by how a man felt when he woke up, but by whether his name appeared on a list, whether his file was marked complete, and whether permission had been granted for him to return fully to routine. The body had stopped being a personal signal and had become a managed condition. A man might feel strong enough to work, yet still be told to wait. Another might feel weak, yet be instructed to proceed as usual. These contradictions did not provoke argument, because the authority behind them was no longer questioned. Medical judgment had replaced instinct, and instinct had already been trained to step aside. What changed most was the meaning of improvement. Healing was no longer something that naturally concluded. It became a process that required confirmation. Bandages came off only when schedules allowed. Activity resumed only when cleared. Even rest, once a simple response to exhaustion, was now regulated, prescribed, and monitored. The prisoners adapted to this system more easily than they expected. Adaptation did not feel like submission. It felt like responsibility. Following instructions appeared sensible, especially when those instructions came from people who spoke calmly, carried no weapons, and framed every limitation as concern rather than control. This framing mattered. Care delivered without visible force rarely triggers resistance. When restrictions are justified as protection, refusing them can feel reckless, even immoral. The men began to police themselves, reminding one another to follow guidance, to avoid strain, to wait for approval. Control no longer needed to arrive from outside. It circulated quietly within the group. The clinic's language reinforced this shift. Words like cleared, authorized, and not yet advisable entered daily conversation. These terms carried weight without sounding threatening. They suggested safety, caution, and expertise, making it difficult to argue against them without appearing unreasonable. As a result, recovery itself became conditional. Feeling better was no longer enough. A man had to be recognized as better. Until that recognition came, movement felt premature and independence felt irresponsible. The body waited for permission even when it no longer needed it. Some prisoners noticed the delay. They sensed that improvement was being acknowledged more slowly than expected, yet they struggled to name the discomfort this created. Challenging the process would have required confidence in their own judgment, and that confidence had already been softened by weeks of deferral. What made this stage especially effective was its subtlety. Nothing about the system suggested punishment. There were no threats for disobedience, no visible penalties for questioning. Yet the consequences of acting without approval remained unclear, and unclear consequences are often more powerful than explicit ones. The men began to imagine risks that were never stated. What if unauthorized activity delayed release? What if it marked a file in some invisible way? What if cooperation was being evaluated over time? These questions were never answered, yet they shaped behavior more effectively than rules ever could. Gradually, the idea of acting independently faded. Decisions were postponed instinctively. Initiative felt inappropriate. Waiting felt safe. The body, once a source of personal endurance, now existed within boundaries defined by someone else's assessment. At this point, recovery no longer represented progress toward freedom. It represented alignment with the system. Being well meant being compliant. Being ready meant being approved. The prisoners had not been restrained physically, yet their movement had been absorbed into a structure that required no fences to function. The most unsettling realization had still not fully surfaced, but it hovered close enough to affect behavior. Control had not been taken abruptly. It had been redistributed, justified by care, and accepted through routine. By the end of this phase, the men no longer asked when they would resume normal life. They waited to be told. And in that waiting, recovery ceased to be a return to autonomy, becoming instead a condition that belonged to someone else's judgment. By this stage, the prisoners no longer experienced the clinic as a place they visited, but as a system that quietly accompanied them wherever they went. Even outside its walls, its influence shaped posture, timing, and decision, because the body had learned to wait for guidance before acting. The most noticeable change was not physical, but internal. Men no longer evaluated their own condition with confidence. A sensation of strength felt incomplete without confirmation. Discomfort felt uncertain without assessment. The body had become something that required interpretation, and interpretation belonged to someone else. This dependence did not feel forced. It felt practical. The clinic had demonstrated competence repeatedly, and competence earns authority without demanding it. Each successful treatment reinforced the belief that outcomes improved when decisions were deferred, encouraging a habit of waiting that settled into daily life. Trust, once limited to the promise of care, now extended to judgment itself. Instructions were followed even when they conflicted with personal experience, because challenging them required effort and risk. Accepting them required neither. Over time, the balance between these choices shifted decisively toward acceptance. The men noticed that independence now carried uncertainty. Acting without approval felt irresponsible, not because punishment was expected, but because deviation might complicate a process that seemed to function smoothly. The system did not threaten consequences. It simply allowed doubt to grow around the idea of acting alone. Language reflected this shift. Prisoners spoke about what they were allowed to do rather than what they felt capable of doing. Readiness was no longer self-determined. It was granted. The body waited for recognition before moving forward, even when no barrier existed. What made this transformation especially effective was its invisibility. Nothing had been taken openly. No right had been revoked. Dependence had formed through routine, reinforced by relief and stability, and normalized by repetition. The men adapted without realizing that adaptation itself was the outcome. As trust deepened, responsibility quietly transferred. Decisions about effort, rest, and movement belonged increasingly to schedules and files. The clinic's authority did not end when a visit concluded. It extended forward in time, shaping future behavior before it occurred. Some prisoners felt a vague discomfort they could not easily explain. They sensed that something essential had shifted, yet struggled to locate the moment when it happened. Without a clear boundary crossing, resistance found no anchor. The change felt natural, even reasonable. The dependence was not absolute, but it was sufficient. It reduced initiative. It softened urgency. It encouraged patience where action once existed. The men had not been instructed to relinquish control. They had been taught that relinquishing it was safer. By the time this realization approached consciousness, the pattern was already established. Trust had completed its transition. It no longer described confidence in care. It described reliance on authority to define what was necessary, appropriate, and permitted. At this point, the clinic no longer needed to intervene actively. The system sustained itself. Waiting became habitual. Compliance became automatic. The body, once endured through hardship, now existed within a framework that did not belong to the man inhabiting it. The mistake had not been trusting the doctors. It had been assuming that trust, once given, would remain limited to healing. Instead, it had expanded quietly, reshaping behavior and expectation until dependence felt indistinguishable from caution. And with that, the final condition settled into place, not through force or deception, but through the simple human instinct to preserve stability once it appears to be working. Nothing dramatic marked the end of this process, because nothing dramatic had ever been required for it to succeed. The clinic continued to operate, the routines remained intact, and the language of care stayed calm and reassuring. What changed was not the body, but the relationship to it. Decisions no longer began internally. Readiness no longer came from instinct. Control had not been taken away, but slowly set aside, replaced by habits that felt reasonable, safe, and responsible. The prisoners were not harmed. They were not deceived in obvious ways. They were treated, stabilized, and returned to routine. Yet somewhere along the way, trust expanded beyond healing and became something that quietly redefined ownership. And that leaves a final question, not about medicine or captivity, but about how easily control can shift when help feels necessary, and whether the most effective systems are the ones that never need to raise their voice at all. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.